It was found in the rubble of a condemned general store in the ghost town of Caddo, Oklahoma, in the summer of 1987. The building had been slated for demolition, its wooden bones rotting after a century of hard weather. But when the wrecking crew pulled back a collapsed section of floorboard, they discovered a small iron strongbox, blackened by smoke and crushed by the weight of the building's collapse. The lock had been shattered, perhaps by the same fire that had singed the box's exterior. Inside, beneath a layer of ash and debris, lay a single leather-bound ledger, its pages warped by water and heat, its spine barely intact. A name was pressed into the front cover in faded gold leaf, *Elias B. Hartwell. The crew assumed it was just old business records, worthless, and tossed it aside. But the construction foreman, a man named Robert Gentry, had a peculiar curiosity for history. He took the ledger home, intending to flip through it before discarding it. Instead, he found himself staying up until 3 in the morning, his hands trembling over its charred pages. It was a murder confession, spanning nearly 3 decades, meticulously detailed. Or at least, it began that way. What Gentry had stumbled upon was not merely a ledger of business accounts, but a list of the dead. And for the past 100 years, no one even knew they were missing. The discovery of Elias B. Hartwell's ledger would upend everything we thought we knew about the dark history of the Choctaw Nation, uncovering a conspiracy of silence that reached from the dusty streets of a small railroad town all the way to the halls of Congress. It is a story of oil, of blood, of a woman who fought to prove that the dead could still speak, and of a town that was built on a foundation of secrets. This is the story of the woman who knew too much. We begin not in 1987, but in 1873, in the untamed heart of Indian Territory, a land of profound contradictions, where ancient tribal laws struggle to coexist with the chaotic forces of American expansion. In the years immediately following the Civil War, the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole, faced an existential crisis. The Reconstruction Treaties of 1866, signed under duress, compelled them to cede vast tracts of land and to permit the construction of railroads across their sovereign territories. These railroads were the arteries of progress, and they would bring new life, but they also brought a plague of outsiders, merchants, speculators, and those with no respect for the laws of the land. The Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railway, known as the Caddo, was the first to penetrate the Choctaw Nation. By 1872, it had laid track through the heart of the territory, reaching Denison, Texas. Along this line, new towns were born overnight: Atoka, Durant, and Caddo, among others. These were rough, violent places, caught between the authority of the tribal governments and the distant, often indifferent, reach of the United States District Court at Fort Smith, Arkansas. It was here that the federal government attempted to enforce its will, often through the hanging judge, Isaac Parker, who sent his deputy marshals into the territory to capture outlaws. But the law was a thin blue line stretched across an ocean of wilderness. In the words of an old saying, there was no Sunday west of St. Louis, and no God west of Fort Smith. Indian Territory was a haven for men who had fled justice in the states. It was a hodgepodge of Indian lands, reservations, and tribal governments, a place where Indian-on-Indian crime was often handled by the tribes, but any crime involving a non-Indian fell under the jurisdiction of the federal court. This jurisdictional crack became a convenient sanctuary for unscrupulous men to operate. It was into this world that Elias B. Hartwell arrived, a man whose past was as shrouded in mystery as the land he now walked. He had been a Union Army quartermaster during the war, a position that gave him an intimate understanding of logistics, accounting, and the grim arithmetic of survival. He knew how to move goods, how to keep records, and how to make money. Hartwell settled in Caddo, a town bustling with coal miners, railroad workers, and merchants. A thriving industry had emerged from the coal mines of the Choctaw Nation. In 1875, Chief Coleman Cole called on the General Council to use the nation's natural resources to fund schools and other tribal improvements. The coal industry became a vital source of revenue for the Choctaw Nation, but it was also a source of friction. The tribal government established the office of the mining trustee to manage the leasing of coal lands. Companies like the Osage Coal and Mining Company, which had a controlling interest held by a white man named James Jackson McAllister, exploited loopholes in Choctaw law. McAllister had arrived in Indian Territory in 1869, working for a trading firm before obtaining a work permit. He eventually married Rebecca Burney, a Choctaw citizen, which granted him the rights of citizenship, allowing him to lease lands from Choctaws and then lease them to coal companies, enriching himself at the expense of the Choctaw community. Hartwell, however, didn't seek to exploit the land, at least not openly. He saw a more lucrative opportunity. He would exploit the exploitation itself. He opened a general store, a modest wooden building on Main Street, that became the commercial hub of the growing town. He sold everything from mining tools to canned goods, from bolts of fabric to patent medicines. But his true trade was information. He was a quiet, observant man who rarely spoke of his past. To the townsfolk, he was a reliable businessman, a regular attendee at church, and a man who kept meticulous, almost obsessive, records. His ledgers were his obsession. The only thing he seemed to care about was his books. And in the back of one of those ledgers, Elias B. Hartwell began a second, secret set of accounts. Not for goods and services, but for crimes. It started small, as such things often do. A miner named Silas Green was found dead in a shallow ravine, beaten to death with a rock. The coroner's report, if there was one, likely ruled it an accident or a dispute among Rowdy's men. Hartwell knew the truth because the killer came to his store the next day, hands still stained, and bought a tin of coffee, paying with a silver dollar that had Green's blood still crusted in the crevices of the eagle's wing. Hartwell wrote the event down. He wrote down the name of the victim. He wrote down the name of the killer. He wrote down the date, the location, and a brief description of the incident. And he wrote down the price. Soon, men came to him seeking to sell not just ore or cattle, but to buy silence. A rancher who had shot a squatter, a railroad foreman who had beaten a Chinese laborer to death, a man who had swindled a Choctaw family out of their allotment. They didn't come to confess. They came to collect their accounts. They might come to buy a shovel, and Hartwell would stare at them until he saw something they could not hide. He would then make a quiet note in his secret ledger. In this way, Hartwell transformed his general store into a clearinghouse for secrets, a kind of bank for blood money. The unspoken agreement was that his silence was guaranteed, provided they paid the fee by continuing to purchase his goods, continuing to feed his empire. The price of silence grew. His store expanded. He became one of the wealthiest men in the county. The town of Caddo, a place that had sprung up along the Katy Railroad, grew around him, its economy increasingly intertwined with the coal mines that were the lifeblood of the Choctaw Nation. He was untouchable. But he made one mistake. He underestimated a woman. Her name was Margaret Maggie Coyle. Maggie Coyle was a schoolteacher from a small, hardscrabble town in Missouri. She was also a widow. Her husband, a former Union soldier named Thomas Coyle, had been found dead in 1876 in a ditch not far from the Hartwell store. The official story was that he had gotten into a drunken brawl and been stabbed. Thomas Coyle was a man of strong convictions and a noted opponent of alcohol. He did not drink. Maggie knew this. She knew her husband had discovered something about Hartwell, something in those meticulous ledgers, and she knew he had planned to take it to the authorities in Fort Smith. When the marshal's report came back, it was dismissive, death by misadventure while intoxicated. The case was closed. No one was charged. Maggie Coyle, a woman with no power, no influence, and no money, did the only thing she could do. She stayed. She took a job as a clerk at the local mercantile, determined to find the truth. She was rebuffed, laughed at, and threatened by Hartwell's men. But she never stopped asking questions. She became a ghost haunting Hartwell's conscience. She would appear at the edges of crowds, a quiet, persistent presence that unnerved him. She began to gather her own records, a parallel ledger of suspicion. She started to compile a list of people who had vanished from Caddo. Disappeared without a trace. There was the young Choctaw woman, Anna, who had been a domestic servant in Hartwell's home. She disappeared in 1878. There was the traveling preacher, Jedediah, who had spoken out against Hartwell's influence in 1881. He disappeared on the road to Atoka. A federal agent who had come asking questions vanished in 1884. In 1883, a resolution was passed by the Choctaw Nation expressing gratitude to the U.S. military for expelling intruders, a clear indication of the constant pressure from settlers seeking to encroach on tribal lands. It was in this environment of simmering tensions that women like Maggie Coyle found themselves increasingly vulnerable, yet she pressed on. Maggie's investigation nearly destroyed her. The town ostracized her, the children in her school were pulled from her classes, and she was forced to live on the charity of the few who believed her. By 1886, she was a shell of her former self, driven nearly to madness by the weight of her knowledge. She was sure Hartwell was responsible for these disappearances, but she could not prove it. She was like a detective in a world with no police force, armed only with a list of names and a burning sense of justice. The pattern was clear: anyone who threatened Hartwell's business, anyone who asked too many questions, anyone who got too close to his secrets, vanished. For a decade, Maggie Coyle was the only person who looked at Elias Hartwell and saw not a respected businessman, but a monster. The timeline of terror was laid out in her mind. The names and dates were seared into her memory. Anna, the servant, went missing in 1878. The preacher, Jedediah, in 1881. The federal agent, whose name she never learned, in 1884. Her husband, Thomas, in 1876. The list of the disappeared grew. She tried to go to the authorities, to the U.S. Marshals at Fort Smith, but she was a woman in 1880s Indian Territory, and her accusations against a powerful, wealthy white man were dismissed. She was told, often and directly, to mind her own business. But she knew that a man like Hartwell would not be satisfied with just a few murders. He was too wealthy, too comfortable, and too sure of his invincibility. He was expanding his operations beyond murder and blackmail. He was moving into the most lucrative racket of all, controlling the land itself. By 1889, the entire country was watching the unassigned lands in the heart of Indian Territory. A vast stretch of roughly 2 million acres, it had not been assigned to any tribal nation. It was prime real estate, waiting to be settled. President Benjamin Harrison had signed a proclamation opening it to settlement, and the date was set, April 22, 1889. The rules were simple: at noon on April 22, a gunshot would sound, and the land rush would begin. Thousands of would-be settlers had gathered on the borders, waiting to stake their claims. But even before the starting gun was fired, there were those who cheated. They were called Sooners. They sneaked across the border illegally and claimed the best land, the riverfront property, the timbered hills, the land with the deepest soil, before the official start time. Boomers like the Dueling Gang and John Hickson would later clash with federal marshals, but for now, the chaotic land run had established a new kind of lawlessness. Elias B. Hartwell saw this as the opportunity of a lifetime. The land rush was a chance to legitimize his empire. He could use the stolen identities and the secrets in his ledger to claim vast tracts of land, effectively laundering his fortune into something permanent and legal. He would need help, of course, to ensure his scheme worked. He would need a conduit, a public face for his plans. That conduit arrived in the form of a young man named Josiah Joe Beckett. Josiah Beckett was a law clerk, a man drawn to the frontier by the promise of adventure and a quick fortune. He arrived in the chaos of 1889, a man of keen intelligence and sharp ambition, but with a weak moral compass. He had a background in surveying and property law, and he was charmed by the idea of building a future. He had no money but possessed a rare skill that was in high demand, an intimate understanding of the new laws and loopholes that would define the land claims. Hartwell met Joe at a land auction and quickly recognized a kindred spirit, or at least a useful one. He offered Joe a position as his business partner, a way to capitalize on the chaos of the land run. Joe was flattered by the offer from the town's most successful and powerful man. He accepted. What Joe didn't realize was that Hartwell was not looking for a partner, he was looking for a fall guy. He was looking for a man who could be molded, controlled, and ultimately destroyed. Hartwell started by telling Joe about his land acquisition process. He showed him the names of men who had died without heirs, men whose land had been left in a legal limbo. He was confident he could secure those parcels. He was less forthcoming about the man who lost the title and went back to Arkansas. He didn't tell Joe about the ledger or the disappearances. Joe, blinded by ambition, bought the story. He worked hard for Hartwell, filing the legal claims and managing the paperwork. He became a confidant, a trusted associate, and he was convinced he was on the path to great success. He even started courting a local woman, a widow who ran a boarding house, and began dreaming of a life beyond his humble origins. But by 1893, Josiah Beckett was a dead man. It was the largest land run of them all, the Cherokee Outlet. On September 16, 1893, nearly 100,000 settlers lined up on the Kansas border to stake their claims on 6.3 million acres of land. It was the last great race. But for Josiah Beckett, the race had already been run. He had been found dead in his office in Caddo, a single bullet to the chest, his filing cabinet ransacked. The official story was that he had killed himself, distraught over a bad investment. The coroner, a man in Hartwell's pocket, ruled it a suicide. The evidence? A note found on his desk, in his own handwriting, expressing remorse for his business failures. The handwriting was undeniable. He was a man with no enemies and no reason to die. Except for one, he had discovered the truth. He had stumbled upon the secret ledger. He had seen the names. He had realized what kind of man he was working for. Perhaps he had even confronted Hartwell, threatening to go to the marshals. Hartwell, of course, was prepared. He had arranged for a man to be in the office that night. He had forced Joe to write the suicide note at gunpoint before ending his life. Joe Beckett's death was the final blow for Maggie Coyle. She knew he was innocent. She knew what had happened to him. But she had no one to turn to. The town of Caddo was solidly behind Hartwell. He was their wealthiest citizen, the man who gave money to the church and the hospital. Any accusation against him was met with hostility. Maggie was becoming a pariah. Then, in 1896, a new character entered the story. Thomas J. Fulcher was an inexperienced prosecutor from Texas, a man who was about to become the unlikely savior of a man on trial for murder. His story, and the many pitfalls for a nascent criminal justice system in a frontier society, helps illustrate the kind of justice that was available in Indian Territory at the time. Cases often relied on legal and illegal ploys. It was a system easily manipulated by wealthy men. For Maggie, the turning point came in 1898. The Osage Coal and Mining Company, which had been facing increasing scrutiny and legal challenges over its operations on Choctaw land, was the subject of a federal investigation. Hartwell, a key shareholder, was desperate to keep his secrets. He had been expecting it, and he had taken steps to ensure his safety. He made a fatal mistake that year. He transferred his most incriminating assets, including the land claims he'd secured through fraud and violence, into the name of a bank in Kansas, a final, desperate act to protect his wealth. But this transfer created a paper trail. A young clerk named Samuel B. Jennings, who had worked at the bank in Kansas, recognized some of the names on the deeds. They were names he'd read about in the newspaper, names of men who had been reported dead. Something was wrong. Jennings, a man of integrity, traveled to Caddo to investigate. He was an outsider, a young man with a sharp mind and a soft heart. He arrived in Caddo in the fall of 1898, and he immediately sensed the unease in the town. He started asking questions about Hartwell. He met Maggie Coyle. He listened to her story, a story she had been telling for 2 decades. He became the first person who truly believed her. He was the first person to see the connection she had been making all those years. He saw the pattern of disappearances, the suicides that were clearly murders, the town that was built on a bedrock of fear. They began working together. Jennings, with his knowledge of banking and law, and Maggie, with her knowledge of the town, its people, and its secrets. They formed an unlikely partnership. Together, they started to piece together the full scope of Hartwell's operation. They started to map out his network of spies, his political connections, and the sheer scale of his criminal enterprise. They knew they had to do something, but they had no power. Jennings, using the authority of his position, began sending dispatches to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Kansas and to the Department of the Interior. He knew he was putting himself in grave danger. As the investigation progressed, they discovered a pattern. The people who were the most afraid of Hartwell were the ones who had been his victims or their families. There were dozens of them, living in the shadow of his power. They were afraid to talk, afraid to testify. They had seen what happened to those who crossed him. In the summer of 1899, the U.S. Attorney's Office finally responded to Jennings's persistent letters. They were sending a special investigator to look into the matter. But they advised Jennings to be discreet. The man's reputation was formidable, and the authorities were wary of making a direct accusation. The investigation was to be a quiet one. And then, in October of 1899, a massive fire swept through the main street of Caddo. It started in a warehouse adjacent to Hartwell's store and quickly spread. When the smoke cleared, Hartwell's store was a smoldering ruin. The iron safe, which had contained his most sensitive documents, was found cracked open, its contents reduced to ash. The secret ledger was believed to have been destroyed. Just as the investigation was gaining momentum, its most important piece of evidence was gone. The town took up a collection to rebuild Hartwell's store. He was hailed as a hero for his courage in the face of such a loss. His insurance payout was substantial. The authorities, with no evidence to support their case, closed the investigation. Maggie Coyle and Samuel Jennings were devastated. They knew it was arson. They knew Hartwell had engineered the fire to destroy his records. They had been so close. Jennings had no choice but to leave Caddo, his position with the bank in Kansas being transferred. He promised Maggie he would keep fighting, but his hands were tied. Maggie was alone again. But she had not been defeated. She had spent years learning to wait. She had kept her own, smaller records, a list of names, dates, and places, a patchwork of evidence that she hoped would one day matter. She knew that one day, Hartwell would slip. One day, he would make a mistake, and she would be there. She believed in a simple truth: the truth would prevail. It had to. For the next few years, she remained in Caddo, a quiet, watchful presence. The town gradually forgot about her, but she never forgot the names of the dead. She was a one-woman crusade, and she refused to give up. Then, in 1906, another change came to Indian Territory. The Dawes Act of 1887 had forced the breakup of tribal lands, and now, the final land sale was taking place, a massive auction of what was left of the territory. Elias B. Hartwell was there, a wealthy man preparing to cement his legacy. He was going to purchase a huge tract of land that he had believed would make him one of the largest landowners in the new state of Oklahoma. But the auction was chaotic, and for the first time in his life, he found himself in a bidding war he couldn't win. He was outbid on the parcel he wanted by a man named Andrew J. McCarter, a wealthy rancher from Texas. Hartwell was furious. He stormed out of the auction house. He felt invincible, just as he had 20 years earlier, when he had ordered the murder of Thomas Coyle. He felt that no one could touch him. And, perhaps, he was right. But he had been too confident. Andrew J. McCarter's purchase of that land would be his downfall, though Hartwell didn't know it yet. McCarter was not just a wealthy man. His son-in-law was Samuel B. Jennings. After years of quiet investigation, Jennings was ready. He had the financial resources and the political connections to finally bring Hartwell down. He had never given up on the case. He had spent the intervening years building a case, cultivating relationships with lawmen and politicians, and waiting for the moment when Hartwell would overreach. Jennings knew Hartwell had committed a crime, land fraud on a massive scale, and he had the evidence to prove it, in the form of Andrew McCarter's land claim. Hartwell had been outbid, but he had already claimed that same land parcel months earlier, using a forged deed. The land was McCarter's now, and Jennings had the proof that Hartwell had forged the documents. It was enough to get an indictment. On November 16, 1907, the state of Oklahoma was admitted to the Union. It was a new beginning for the territory. For Elias B. Hartwell, it was the beginning of the end. In December 1907, a U.S. Marshal from Fort Smith arrived in Caddo with a warrant for Hartwell's arrest. The warrant was for land fraud. It was a secondary charge, a small piece of the larger conspiracy, but it was enough to bring him in. Hartwell was taken by surprise. He had expected to be untouchable. He had expected to be above the law. He was the richest man in the county. But the new state of Oklahoma was not Indian territory. It was a place with its own laws, its own judicial system, and its own ambitions. Hartwell was taken to the courthouse in Ardmore for his preliminary hearing. The courtroom was packed. The whole town of Caddo seemed to have traveled there to see the fall of their titan. Maggie Coyle was there, sitting in the back. So was Samuel Jennings, who had returned to deliver the final blow. McCarter was there, too, his face a mask of quiet satisfaction. The prosecution's case was simple and strong. They presented evidence that Hartwell had used forged documents to claim land that was never legally his. The case was so strong that the judge immediately held him over for trial by a grand jury. Hartwell was led from the courtroom in handcuffs. He was taken to the federal jail in Muskogee to await trial. He was a broken man. He was forced to share a cell with common criminals, men he would have once looked down upon. The weight of his crimes, of his decades of deception, had finally caught up with him. On January 14, 1908, the day of his trial, Hartwell appeared in the courtroom. His trademark arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet desperation. The trial was swift. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours before returning a verdict, guilty. He was sentenced to 20 years in the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas. He was an old man now, and it was effectively a life sentence. But the most haunting part of the story is what happened after his conviction. As he was being led from the courtroom, Maggie Coyle, the woman who had never given up, approached him. She was an old woman now herself, her hair white and her back bent from years of hardship. She had waited 32 years for this moment. She pulled a piece of paper from her pocket, a list of names. "I have one question, Mr. Hartwell," she said, her voice steady and clear. She read the names: Thomas Coyle, Anna, Jedediah, the federal agent, Josiah Beckett. Each name hung in the air like a shroud. "Each of these people just disappeared," she said. "Disappeared without a trace. No one was ever charged. But I know you killed them. I have always known." "Did you? Did you kill my husband?" The courtroom was silent. Everyone was waiting for Hartwell's answer. He looked at her. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then, he simply smiled, a cold, chilling smile. "I'm a man of business, Mrs. Coyle," he said softly, in a voice that was almost a whisper. "Those people simply became bad investments." He turned and walked away. It was the closest thing to a confession he ever gave. The implications were clear, but without the body, without the evidence, he could not be charged for those crimes. The law had caught him, but it had not caught all of him. He had kept the secret of the ledger, the secret of his true crimes, locked in his mind. Elias B. Hartwell died in Leavenworth Prison in 1912, taking the full truth with him. His ledger, believed to have been destroyed in the fire, was never found. But it wasn't destroyed. He had kept a copy. Or rather, he hadn't destroyed the original. He had been too careful for that. He had hidden it in his store, beneath a floorboard. It survived the fire, just as his secrets had survived for so long. When Robert Gentry found the ledger in 1987, it changed everything. The list of names in Hartwell's secret ledger was the same list of names Maggie Coyle had carried in her pocket for decades. The names matched perfectly. The ledger was the proof she had never been able to produce. It catalogued the disappearances, the murders, and the bribes that Hartwell had orchestrated for nearly 30 years. It revealed the extent of his power, the web of corruption he had woven, and the deaths he had caused. The ledger also contained a name that was never mentioned in any official record, a name of a person who was still alive in 1908. It was a name that would have exposed a conspiracy that went far beyond Elias B. Hartwell, a conspiracy that involved the highest levels of government, the land speculators, and the railroad barons who had made their fortunes on the backs of the Choctaw people. Who was that name? The identity of that person and the full scope of the conspiracy remain a mystery to this day. The final pages of the ledger were too charred to be read. What we know for certain is that on November 16, 1907, the state of Oklahoma was admitted to the Union. It was a moment of triumph for many, but a funeral for the sovereignty of the 5 tribes. The land that had been guaranteed to them in treaties was now open to all. Elias Hartwell was convicted not for the lives he took, but for the land he stole. The system that protected him for so long also destroyed him in the end. It was a hollow victory for a woman who had sacrificed everything to find the truth. Elias Hartwell had said, those people simply became bad investments. He saw people as assets to be liquidated. The ledger found in 1987 proved that he was one of the most prolific murderers in American history, a man who had turned murder into a business. But there is still one question that lingers. Who was the name on the final, charred page? The discovery of the ledger solved a mystery that had haunted Caddo for over a century. The dead could finally be named and mourned. But it also revealed that the truth, like a ghost, is not always fully visible. Some truths are burned beyond recognition. Some questions are never answered. The secret ledger of Elias B. Hartwell is now kept in the Oklahoma History Center, a silent testament to a forgotten chapter of American history. Its pages are fragile, its ink is faded, but its story is clear. It is the story of a killer who almost got away with it. And it is the story of a woman who never stopped believing in the truth. The names of those who disappeared are no longer forgotten. The ledger has returned them to the light, reminding us that the past is never truly dead. It is never truly past. And as for Maggie Coyle, her story is one of quiet, relentless heroism. She fought a battle that no one else would fight, using the only weapon she had, her determination to know the truth. The discovery of the ledger was a victory. But the story is not over. It never is. The shadows of the past still linger in places like Caddo, a ghost town that was once a place of immense wealth and unspeakable darkness. We can walk its empty streets and wonder about the lives that were lived and lost there. We can read the names in Hartwell's ledger and mourn the dead. But we will never fully know the truth. Perhaps that's the way it should be. Perhaps the truth is not always meant to be fully known. Sometimes, the greatest mysteries are the ones that remain unsolved. They remind us of the limits of our knowledge, the fragility of justice, and the enduring power of secrets. In the end, Elias B. Hartwell's story is a warning. It is a warning about the corrupting influence of unchecked power and the fragility of the law in a lawless land. It is a reminder that the truth, no matter how deeply it is buried, has a way of eventually rising to the surface. The secret ledger remains, a final, chilling piece of a puzzle that may never be completely solved. What else did it contain? What other secrets lie hidden, waiting to be discovered? And who, ultimately, was the true mastermind behind the conspiracy that Elias Hartwell served? The answers may lie in the dusty archives, hidden in plain sight, waiting for another Maggie Coyle to ask the questions that no one else will ask.